In exactly 47 seconds, Marcus Chen would laugh for the last time as a millionaire. But he didn't know that yet. Right now, in this precise moment, he was doing what he did best, flaunting his wealth like a peacock displaying its feathers, completely unaware that someone had been systematically plucking those feathers out, one by one, for the past 48 hours. The restaurant was called Étoile Noire, which Marcus always mispronounced with an American accent that made the French maître d' visibly cringe. Not that Marcus noticed. Not that Marcus cared. The reservation list for this place stretched 6 months into the future, but Marcus Chen never waited. He never had to. A discreet phone call, a name dropped here, a generous tip there, and suddenly tables materialized out of thin air. Money, Marcus had learned over the past 15 years, was the ultimate solvent. It dissolved obstacles, erased inconveniences, and opened doors that remained firmly locked for ordinary people. Tonight's dinner companion was Richard Brenner, a venture capitalist with more degrees than personality and a handshake that felt like grabbing a dead fish. They sat at the corner table, the one with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the glittering cityscape below, where millions of people hustled and struggled and worried about bills, while Marcus casually ordered a bottle of wine that cost more than most of them made in a month. The Chateau Margaux 1996, $3,200, before tax, before tip. Marcus didn't even particularly like wine. He just liked the way people's eyes widened when he ordered it. The waiter approached with that particular brand of obsequiousness reserved for the ultra-wealthy, his spine curved in a slight bow that suggested both respect and resentment. Marcus barely glanced at him. The waiter was furniture, scenery, a prop in Marcus's personal stage production. His name tag read Anton, but Marcus would never remember it, would never think to ask about Anton's life, his dreams, his struggling mother back in Lyon, his night classes at community college. None of that registered in Marcus Chen's world. You either had money or you didn't, and if you didn't, you simply weren't real. The acquisition closes Friday, Marcus was saying, swirling his wine in a gesture he'd copied from a movie because he thought it looked sophisticated. 23 million for a company that's bleeding money. Everyone said I was insane. He paused for effect, that trademark smirk playing across his lips. But that's what they said about my last 4 acquisitions, and where are those critics now, still trading their time for paychecks while I'm buying their employers? Richard pushed his glasses up his nose, a nervous habit that betrayed his discomfort. The due diligence seems thin, Marcus. 3 weeks for a company that size. Due diligence is for people who are afraid to pull the trigger. Marcus leaned back, his Italian leather chair creaking softly. His suit, Brioni, custom-tailored, $11,000, fit him like a second skin. His watch, Patek Philippe Nautilus, $150,000, caught the candlelight and threw tiny golden stars across the white tablecloth. Everything about Marcus Chen screamed success, wealth, power, everything except his eyes. His eyes, if you looked closely enough, if you dared to look past the expensive veneer, carried something hollow, something desperate, something that no amount of money had managed to fill. But nobody looked that closely anymore. The money was too bright, too dazzling. It blinded people to everything else. You know what your problem is, Richard? Marcus continued, not waiting for an answer because he never did. You overthink, analysis paralysis. By the time you've finished your 3rd spreadsheet, I've already closed the deal and moved on to the next one. That's the difference between people like you and people like me. The words hung in the air, arrogant and sharp. Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He took a long sip of his wine, wine that he hadn't paid for, wine that Marcus had ordered without asking his preference, wine that tasted like ashes in his mouth because this entire dinner was a reminder of every opportunity Richard had missed, every risk he'd been too cautious to take, every time he'd chosen safety over ambition. But there was something Richard knew that Marcus didn't. There was a reason Richard had suggested this dinner, had insisted on tonight specifically. Richard had heard whispers, rumors floating through the corridors of high finance like ghosts, something about Marcus's CFO, Something about offshore accounts. Something about the FBI asking questions in very quiet, very careful ways. Richard was many things, but he wasn't stupid. He'd learned long ago to position himself on the right side of disasters, to read the subtle signs that preceded collapse. And Marcus Chen, for all his bravado, for all his apparent invincibility, was standing at the edge of a cliff without realizing the ground beneath his feet had already begun to crumble. The first course arrived, some architectural marvel of foam and microgreens that cost $60 and would leave both men hungry. Marcus picked at it absently, still talking, always talking, his voice a constant stream of self-aggrandizement and casual cruelty disguised as business wisdom. He talked about his latest yacht upgrade, his penthouse renovation, his private jet lease, each sentence a carefully aimed dart designed to remind Richard of their respective positions in the financial food chain. What Marcus didn't talk about was the divorce. He never talked about that. 3 years ago now, but the wound still festered beneath the expensive suits and practiced confidence. Catherine had taken their daughter Emma and left, citing emotional neglect, workaholism, and a dozen other accusations that Marcus had dismissed as feminine hysteria. He'd thrown money at the situation, generous child support, a house in the suburbs, anything to make the problem go away. But Emma, now 14, barely spoke to him. His weekly calls went to voicemail. His expensive gifts arrived at her door and disappeared into her room, never mentioned, never acknowledged. He told himself she'd understand when she was older, when she realized that everything he'd done for her. The money he'd made, the empire he'd built, it was all for Emma's future. She'd see that eventually. She had to, except Emma didn't want money, she wanted a father. But Marcus Chen had forgotten how to be that person, if he'd ever known how in the first place. You know what I love about this city? Marcus gestured toward the window with his fork. Everyone out there is fighting for scraps while we're up here deciding who gets to eat. It's Darwinian, beautiful in its own way. Richard set down his wine glass with perhaps more force than necessary. You ever wonder if we're the villains in someone else's story, Marcus? The question landed like a stone in still water. For just a moment, a fraction of a second, really something flickered across Marcus's face. Doubt, guilt, self-awareness. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared, buried under layers of practiced arrogance and willful blindness. Villains, Marcus laughed, that booming, self-assured laugh that filled the space around him. Richard, there are no villains. There are winners and losers, and the losers write the history that makes them feel better about losing. You think Rockefeller cared what the railroad workers thought of him? You think Carnegie lost sleep over the factory conditions? They built empires, and empires aren't built by asking permission or worrying about feelings. The second course arrived, then the third. The conversation meandered through business gossip, market predictions, speculation about whose company would crash next. Marcus held court like a king addressing his subjects, every anecdote carefully curated to showcase his brilliance, his foresight, his superiority. Richard listened with the kind of patient attention that comes from knowing a secret, waiting for the moment to deploy it. That moment came with dessert, some deconstructed chocolate thing that probably had a French name Marcus couldn't pronounce. The restaurant had begun to empty, the late dinner crowd filtering out into the night. Only a handful of tables remained occupied, and the ambient noise had dropped to a gentle murmur punctuated by the soft clink of silverware against porcelain. Richard leaned forward, his voice dropping to something almost conspiratorial. I heard David's been spending time offshore. Cayman Islands, specifically, seems like an odd vacation spot for your CFO during acquisition season. The comment was designed to unsettle, and for a microsecond it succeeded. Marcus's hand paused halfway to his mouth, his fork suspended in mid-air. David Reeves, his chief financial officer, brilliant with numbers, detail-oriented, trustworthy. They'd worked together for 7 years. David had been at Marcus's side through every major deal, every expansion, every triumph. If anyone understood the intricate web of Marcus's financial empire, it was David. But Marcus recovered quickly, his trademark confidence reasserting itself. David's been working on the Caribbean expansion, due diligence for the resort properties. You know how it is, someone has to actually visit these places before we buy them. Right. Richard's smile was thin, knowing. Just seemed unusual timing, that's all, especially with the SEC asking questions about your last quarterly report. The SEC asks questions about everyone's quarterly report. It's their job. But Marcus's voice had acquired an edge, a sharpness that betrayed his irritation. He didn't like being questioned. He didn't like the implication that his business affairs were anything less than immaculate. And he especially didn't like the way Richard was looking at him now, with something that resembled pity. The tension at the table had shifted, subtle but undeniable. Marcus decided to end the evening on his terms. He signaled for the check with an imperious wave, and Anton appeared with the leather folder containing a bill that would make most people's eyes water. Marcus barely glanced at it before sliding his American Express Centurion card across the table, the famous black card, with its initiation fee of $10,000 and annual fee of $5,000. It was a status symbol, a statement, a way of saying, I belong to a club you can't even imagine joining. Anton disappeared with the card, and Marcus turned back to Richard with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. You worry too much, Richard. That's why you'll never break into the nine-figure. You've got to trust your instincts, trust your team, and most importantly, trust that the universe rewards those who take bold action. But Richard wasn't looking at Marcus anymore. His attention had shifted to something behind Marcus's shoulder, something that had caused his expression to go carefully neutral. Marcus turned to follow his gaze and saw Anton returning to the table, but the waiter's demeanor had changed. The obsequious curve of his spine had straightened. His expression carried something uncomfortable, embarrassment mixed with confusion. Monsieur Chen, Anton said quietly, discreetly, in the way that good waiters deliver bad news. I'm afraid there seems to be an issue with your card. The payment was declined. The words landed like a slap. Marcus's face flushed red, anger rising quick and hot. That's impossible. Run it again. There's obviously a mistake. We've attempted 3 times, sir. Perhaps you have another form of payment. The restaurant seemed to have gone quiet, though that was probably Marcus's imagination. Richard was studying his dessert plate with intense fascination, doing his best to disappear from this awkward moment. Other diners continued their conversations, oblivious to the minor drama unfolding in the corner. But to Marcus, it felt like every eye in the room had turned toward him, witnessing his humiliation. Run it again, Marcus repeated through gritted teeth. Check with your manager. Call the credit card company. Something's wrong with your machine. Anton nodded and retreated, taking the card with him. Marcus sat rigid in his chair, his mind racing through possibilities. A technical glitch. A security hold because of an unusual charge. Maybe he'd forgotten to pay last month's bill, though that seemed unlikely. His assistant Sarah handled all that. There was no reason, no logical explanation for why his card would be declined. He had money. He had so much money. This was ridiculous. Richard finally broke the silence, his voice carefully neutral. Want me to cover it? We can settle up later. The offer was worse than the declined card. Marcus Chen did not get rescued by venture capitalists with dead fish handshakes and mediocre portfolios. Marcus Chen did not need anyone's charity. Marcus Chen was the one who covered checks, who picked up tabs, who demonstrated his financial dominance through casual displays of extravagant spending. Absolutely not. The words came out harsh, clipped. This is obviously a mistake, I'll handle it. But even as he said it, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered something uncomfortable. A detail he'd ignored earlier, a phone call from Sarah yesterday that he'd been too busy to return, something about account statements, something about irregularities. He dismissed it as routine, something that could wait until Monday. But now, sitting in this expensive restaurant with a declined credit card and Richard's pitying gaze burning into him, that ignored detail suddenly felt significant. Anton returned with the restaurant manager. a thin woman in an impeccable suit who approached the table with the kind of professional courtesy that barely concealed her skepticism. "Monsieur Chen, we've contacted the card company. They've indicated the account has been flagged for suspicious activity and has been temporarily frozen. They suggest you contact them directly to resolve the issue." Frozen, the word echoed in Marcus's skull. Accounts didn't get frozen without reason. This wasn't a technical glitch or a missed payment. This was something else, something wrong, something that made his stomach clench with the first real tendrils of fear. "I'll use a different card." Marcus reached for his wallet, hands steady through sheer force of will. He produced a Chase Sapphire Reserve, then a Visa signature, then his personal Bank of America card. Anton took each one in turn, disappeared, returned with increasingly uncomfortable expressions. Declined, declined, declined. The restaurant manager's professional courtesy was beginning to crack, revealing irritation underneath. Richard had started looking at his phone, desperately seeking an excuse to leave. The other diners were definitely watching now, curiosity overcoming decorum. Anton stood at a respectful distance, his earlier obsequiousness completely absent, replaced by the barely concealed contempt of a service worker watching a rich person's facade crack. Marcus's mind was spiraling now, panic beginning to override reason. 4 cards declined, 4 separate accounts, 4 separate banks, all refusing his charges simultaneously. That wasn't possible unless what? Unless something was catastrophically wrong. Unless someone had done something to his accounts. Unless the money he'd assumed would always be there, the money that defined his identity and determined his worth, the money that separated him from the masses and elevated him to this rarefied height, unless that money was somehow, impossibly, inexplicably gone. "I need to make a phone call," Marcus said, standing abruptly. His chair scraped against the floor with an ugly screech that made several diners wince. "I'll be right back." He didn't wait for permission, didn't acknowledge Richard or the manager or Anton. He just moved, striding toward the restaurant's entrance with his phone already in his hand, his thumb jabbing at Sarah's number with increasing desperation. The call went straight to voicemail. He tried again, voicemail. He tried David's number, his CFO, the one person who should know exactly what was happening with his accounts. That call rang once, twice, 3 times, and then disconnected. Not voicemail, disconnected. Like the number had been deactivated, like David had vanished. Marcus stood in the restaurant's marble lobby, expensive art on the walls and a fountain gurgling serenely in the corner, and felt the first real crack in his carefully constructed reality. His hands were shaking now, his breath was coming faster. He opened his phone's banking app, the one that let him check balances with a simple tap, the one he rarely bothered using because who needs to check their balance when there's always more money than you could possibly spend? The app loaded slowly, each second stretching into eternity. The restaurant's ambient jazz filtered through the lobby, jauntily cheerful, grotesquely inappropriate. Marcus's heart hammered against his ribs. Somewhere behind him, he heard Richard's voice making excuses, probably offering to pay the bill, probably telling the manager that his companion was experiencing some sort of emergency. The words barely registered. All of Marcus's attention was focused on the phone screen, watching that little loading circle spin and spin and spin. And then it loaded. The numbers appeared. And Marcus Chen's entire world, his carefully constructed empire of arrogance and assumed superiority, his identity as a self-made millionaire, his shield against the vulnerability he'd spent 15 years running from, all of it collapsed in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The balance read, $0, not just one account. He scrolled frantically, thumbs sliding across the screen with increasing desperation. Checking account, $0. Savings account, $0. Investment account, $0. Money market, $0. Every single account, every repository of wealth he'd accumulated over 15 years of ruthless business deals and careful investments, every dollar he'd earned or inherited or fought for gone, all of it. Gone. For several seconds, Marcus couldn't breathe, couldn't think. couldn't process what he was seeing. This had to be a glitch, a massive system failure, a cyber attack affecting multiple banks simultaneously. There was no other explanation. Money didn't just disappear. Millions of dollars didn't evaporate overnight. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. But then he saw the transaction history. Dozens of transfers over the past 48 hours, each one siphoning money out of his accounts in carefully calculated amounts. Wire transfers to offshore accounts he didn't recognize. Purchases he'd never made. Cash withdrawals at ATMs he'd never visited. Someone had systematically, methodically, professionally drained every account he owned, and he'd been so busy congratulating himself on his latest acquisition, so confident in his invulnerability, so certain that bad things only happened to other people, that he'd never even noticed. The phone slipped from his trembling hands and clattered against the marble floor. Marcus stared at it lying there, screen cracked now, still displaying those devastating zeros. Behind him, Richard's footsteps approached, and when he spoke, his voice carried a quality Marcus had never heard directed at him before. Pity. Marcus, Marcus, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost. But Marcus wasn't a millionaire anymore. He was just a man in an expensive suit that would soon be repossessed, standing in a restaurant he could no longer afford, facing a bill he couldn't pay, staring at the smoking ruins of everything he thought he knew about himself and his place in the world. And somewhere out there, someone was laughing at him. Someone had planned this, executed this, destroyed him with the kind of precision that suggested intimate knowledge of his finances, his accounts, his life. Someone he'd trusted. Someone who'd been close enough to learn all his secrets. Someone who'd been playing a very long game while Marcus had been too arrogant, too blind, too convinced of his own superiority to see the trap being carefully constructed around him. The question that should have been haunting Marcus for weeks. The question he'd been too arrogant to ask himself, too convinced of his invincibility to consider, suddenly screamed through his mind with devastating clarity. When you spend 15 years making enemies, stepping on people, dismissing everyone beneath you as irrelevant, treating trust as a weakness and loyalty as a transaction, when you burn every bridge and mock every warning, when you let money blind you to the very real danger of forgotten grudges and patient revenge, when you build your empire on other people's failures and celebrate every time someone else stumbles. How many people are standing in the shadows right now, watching your fall with satisfaction? And more importantly, which one of them just took everything from you? What would you do if everything you thought defined you vanished in 47 seconds? Would you even know who you are without it? The thing about falling is that you never realize how high you were until you're halfway to the ground, and by then, it's far too late to grab onto anything. Marcus Chen learned this truth at 2:47 a.m. on a Thursday morning, sitting on the cold bathroom floor of the Etoile Noir restaurant, phone pressed against his ear, while a recorded voice told him for the 7th time that all representatives were currently assisting other customers, and his estimated wait time was 43 minutes. 43 minutes. He didn't have 43 minutes. He didn't have 43 seconds. His entire world was collapsing at a speed that defied physics, and somewhere in a call center, someone was eating a sandwich and taking their time answering phones while Marcus Chen's life disintegrated in real time. Richard had paid the bill. That detail would haunt Marcus for weeks afterward, not the money itself, but the expression on Richard's face as he'd slid his card across the table. Not quite pity, not quite satisfaction, something in between. The look you give someone who'd been standing too close to the edge for too long, someone whose fall you'd been anticipating, maybe even hoping for, in that dark part of human nature that finds comfort in other people's disasters. Marcus had stumbled out of the restaurant like a drunk, though he'd barely touched his wine, his legs uncertain beneath him, his vision tunneling down to a pinpoint of desperate focus. Get home, check the computer, fix this. There had to be a way to fix this. The taxi ride home had cost $18. Marcus had 3 crumpled 20s in his wallet, physical cash he rarely carried, Because why would someone like Marcus Chen need cash when credit cards opened every door? He'd handed the driver a 20 and told him to keep the change, muscle memory from 15 years of tipping extravagantly, of demonstrating wealth through casual generosity. The driver had looked at him strangely, probably wondering why someone in a Brioni suit was treating a $2 tip like a major expense. But that $2 suddenly mattered. If Marcus had $0 in his accounts, then those 320s represented the entirety of his liquid assets. $60, the same amount he'd casually dropped on a single dish of deconstructed foam just an hour earlier. His penthouse occupied the top 3 floors of the Meridian Tower, 40 stories of steel and glass overlooking the city like a modern Olympus. The monthly fees alone cost more than most people's annual salaries, $12,000 for maintenance, security, amenities. Marcus had never questioned the expense because what was $12,000 when you had millions? It was nothing, invisible, background noise. But now, riding the elevator up with those 320s burning a hole in his pocket and zeros glowing in his mind, $12,000 seemed like an impossible fortune, an insurmountable mountain, a debt that would crush him. The elevator doors opened directly into his foyer, another luxury, another symbol of exclusivity. Private elevator access meant you didn't have to share space with neighbors, didn't have to make small talk or acknowledge other people's existence. Marcus had loved that isolation. Now it felt like a cage. His footsteps echoed against Italian marble floors as he moved through rooms that suddenly felt like museum exhibits of a life that no longer existed. The Basquiat on the wall, $200,000. The Herman Miller furniture, $60,000 for the living room set. The custom kitchen that he never cooked in because Marcus Chen ate at restaurants where other people prepared his meals. $140,000 of appliances that existed purely to increase property value. His home office occupied what should have been a bedroom, floor-to-ceiling windows on 2 walls providing a panoramic view of the city. His computer sat on a desk made from a single slab of walnut, hand-carved by some artisan whose name Marcus had forgotten immediately after writing the check. He collapsed into his chair, an Aeron $1,200, ergonomically designed to support posture during long work sessions, and opened his laptop with hands that still trembled despite his best efforts to control them. The banking websites loaded one by one, each screen a fresh knife wound. 0, 0, 0. He checked accounts he'd forgotten existed, old investments from his early days, emergency funds he'd established and then ignored. All of them drained, all of them emptied with surgical precision. The transaction histories read like autopsy reports, clinical documentations of systematic murder. Wire transfer to account ending in 7743, $847,000. Wire transfer to account ending in 9281, $1,200,000. ATM withdrawal Grand Cayman, $10,000. The amounts were staggering, the speed impossible, 48 hours. Someone had dismantled his financial empire in less than 2 days, and he'd been completely, devastatingly oblivious. Marcus pulled up his email, searching for alerts, notifications, anything that should have warned him this was happening. But his inbox was suspiciously clean. No fraud alerts from his banks, no unusual activity warnings, no automated messages about large transfers requiring verification. Either the thief had been sophisticated enough to intercept and delete these alerts, or, and this thought made Marcus's stomach drop, someone with authorized access to his accounts had executed these transfers, someone whose actions wouldn't trigger security protocols because the system recognized them as legitimate. David. The name crystallized in Marcus's mind with the weight of certainty. David Reeves, his CFO, the man he'd trusted with every financial detail of his business and personal life. David, who'd been vacationing in the Cayman Islands. David, whose phone was now disconnected. David, who'd spent 7 years learning every password, every account number, every security question answer. David, who'd smiled and nodded and taken notes, while Marcus had barked orders and made demands and treated him like an expensive calculator with legs. But why? What had Marcus done to warrant this level of betrayal? Sure, he'd been demanding. Maybe he'd never asked about David's family, his hobbies, his life outside the office. Perhaps there had been Christmas bonuses that weren't quite as generous as they could have been, promotions that Marcus had promised but never delivered. But those were just normal business relationships, weren't they? You paid people to do jobs, they did the jobs, everyone went home. There was no reason for this, no justification for complete destruction. Unless there was, unless Marcus had been blind to something obvious, something everyone else had seen, unless his arrogance had created an enemy so motivated, so patient, so methodical that they'd spent years planning this exact moment. The thought was interrupted by his phone buzzing, an unknown number. Marcus answered it with desperate hope. Maybe his bank, maybe David calling to explain this was all a terrible misunderstanding. Maybe anyone with information that could help him climb out of this nightmare. Mr. Chen, a woman's voice, professional but with an edge of steel underneath. This is Special Agent Victoria Martinez with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I'm going to need you to come down to our office first thing tomorrow morning. We have some questions about your financial activities. FBI, the words hit Marcus like a physical blow. This wasn't just theft. This was bigger, darker, more dangerous than he'd imagined. The FBI didn't get involved in simple cases of stolen money. They investigated fraud, money laundering, organized crime. They built cases that sent people to prison for decades. I'm the victim here, Marcus said, his voice cracking despite his efforts to sound authoritative. Someone stole everything from me. You should be helping me, not questioning me. Agent Martinez's silence stretched long enough to communicate volumes. When she finally spoke, her tone carried the kind of patient skepticism reserved for people who are definitely lying. We'll discuss that tomorrow, Mr. Chen, 9 a.m. Federal Building, 5th floor. If you fail to appear, I'll assume you're fleeing and issue a warrant. Do we understand each other? The call ended before Marcus could respond. He stared at his phone, at his reflection in the darkened screen, and saw someone he didn't recognize. Fear had reshaped his features, carved new lines around his eyes, tightened his jaw into something desperate. This was the face of someone who'd lost control. This was what vulnerability looked like, and Marcus hated it, hated the weakness it represented, hated that he'd become the kind of person who could be destroyed. But the night wasn't finished with him yet. Oh no, the universe had decided that this particular Thursday would be Marcus Chen's comprehensive education in how quickly fortune can reverse, how thoroughly pride can be demolished, how completely a life can unravel when the threads holding it together turn out to have been rotted through all along. His phone rang again. Sarah, this time, his assistant, the one person who should have been asleep at 3 in the morning, but apparently had her own crisis to manage. Marcus answered with something approaching relief, because Sarah would know what to do. Sarah always knew what to do. Sarah was the organized brain behind his chaotic genius. Marcus. Her voice was tight, controlled, like someone delivering news about a terminal diagnosis. I've been trying to reach you for 6 hours. We have a serious problem, several serious problems. I'm at the office now, and Marcus, are you sitting down? He was already sitting, but the question made him grip the armrests of his $1,200 chair like a drowning man clutching driftwood. What kind of problems? The kind where the FBI showed up at the office at 7 p.m. with a warrant. They've seized all our financial records, all the computers, all the files. They're investigating allegations of securities fraud, money laundering, and wire fraud. They're saying you've been operating a shell company scheme, moving money through offshore accounts to avoid taxes and hide assets. Marcus, they have documentation, transaction records, emails with your signature, bank statements showing systematic transfers to the Cayman Islands, the British Virgin Islands, Switzerland. They're building a case. that's going to send you to prison for 20 years. The words came at Marcus like bullets, each one finding its mark, each one tearing through another layer of his assumptions about reality. Shell companies, offshore schemes, he'd never set up anything like that. He'd never authorized transfers to tax havens. His business was aggressive but legal, ruthless but within the boundaries of regulation. He'd made enemies but he hadn't committed crimes. Had he? No, this was David's work. David had access to everything: bank accounts, email servers, financial systems. David could have created these schemes in Marcus's name, forged signatures, fabricated documentation. This was a frame job, elaborate and devastating, designed not just to steal Marcus's money, but to destroy his freedom, his reputation, his entire existence. Sarah, I didn't do any of this. Someone's framing me. David, it has to be David. He's been planning this. He's stolen everything and made it look like I'm the criminal. Another pause, this one heavier than Agent Martinez's. When Sarah spoke again, her voice carried a quality Marcus had never heard from her before: doubt. Marcus, I want to believe you, I do, but the FBI agents showed me some of the emails. They're from your account, your IP address, time stamped during hours when you were definitely at the office. And the signatures, Marcus, if those are forgeries, they're perfect. They're going to be very hard to dispute. How do you prove you didn't do something when all the evidence says you did? How do you convince anyone of your innocence when every document, every transaction, every piece of digital evidence points directly at you? Marcus had built his fortune on understanding systems, on exploiting loopholes, on knowing how financial mechanisms worked. Now someone had turned that knowledge against him, had weaponized his own expertise to construct an unescapable trap. I need you to find David, Marcus said, his voice hardening with desperate determination. Track him down, find out where he is, what he's doing. There has to be a trail. People don't just vanish. I've been trying, Marcus. His phone's disconnected. His apartment's empty. I sent someone to check. His girlfriend says she hasn't seen him in a week. Says he told her he was working on a special project for you. Even his mother doesn't know where he is. It's like he planned this disappearing act months in advance. Of course he had. This wasn't improvisation. This was choreography. Every step calculated, every contingency anticipated. David hadn't just stolen Marcus's money, he'd stolen his identity, his reputation, his future. And he'd done it so skillfully that even people who'd worked with Marcus for years were starting to wonder if maybe the arrogant millionaire had finally crossed the line from aggressive capitalism into outright criminality. The sun rose while Marcus sat at his desk, still wearing his $11,000 suit, watching the city wake up through his floor-to-ceiling windows. Out there, millions of people were starting their normal Thursday routines: coffee, commutes, complaints about bosses and bills. Normal problems, manageable problems. The kind of problems Marcus had thought were beneath him just 24 hours ago. Now he would have traded everything, well, everything he used to have, to experience that kind of ordinary worry. The FBI interview was exactly as degrading as Marcus had feared. Agent Martinez was joined by Agent Chen, no relation. She clarified with a slight smile, as if the shared surname was some kind of cosmic joke. They sat across from Marcus in a windowless room that smelled like old coffee and broken dreams, a table between them scarred by years of desperate people making desperate statements. They laid out documents like dealers showing their cards in poker, each one worse than the last. Wire transfers Marcus supposedly authorized, emails Marcus allegedly sent, phone records showing calls Marcus apparently made. Shell corporations registered in Marcus's name in jurisdictions that specialized in financial secrecy. The documentation was flawless, overwhelming, impossible to refute without evidence Marcus didn't have. And throughout it all, Agent Martinez watched him with eyes that had seen 1,000 white-collar criminals claim innocence. Eyes that had learned to spot the difference between genuine confusion and calculated lies. Here's what I think happened, Mr. Chen, Agent Martinez said, her voice almost gentle, almost sympathetic. "I think you got greedy. I think 15 years of legitimate business success wasn't enough. I think you wanted more, wanted to protect your assets from taxes, wanted to hide money from your ex-wife's divorce settlement. So you worked with David Reeves to set up this offshore network. But David got greedy too, didn't he? Started skimming a little extra for himself. And now you're both in trouble, except David was smart enough to run while you were too arrogant to see this coming." The accusation made Marcus want to scream, to flip the table, to do something violent and cathartic that would release the pressure building in his chest. But he'd watched enough crime dramas to know that displays of anger only made you look guilty. So he sat there, hands folded on the scarred table, and tried to explain that he was a victim, not a perpetrator. The agents nodded. They took notes. They asked follow-up questions that suggested they didn't believe a single word coming out of his mouth. "We're freezing all your remaining assets pending investigation," Agent Chen said as the interview wound down. "That includes the penthouse, the cars, anything of value that could be considered proceeds of criminal activity. We'll be applying for a full restraining order on your properties tomorrow morning." "I need somewhere to live," Marcus heard himself say, and hated how small his voice sounded. "I need money for food, for basic expenses." Agent Martinez actually laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Should have thought of that before you decided to launder money, Mr. Chen, but don't worry. Federal prisons provide 3 meals a day. You'll be fine." They let him go with orders not to leave the state, not to make any large purchases, not to contact David Reeves or anyone associated with the investigation. Marcus walked out of the federal building into morning sunshine that felt accusatory, too bright, too cheerful for what had just happened to him. His phone was already buzzing with calls from reporters. Somehow the news had leaked, because bad news always leaks, always spreads, always finds its way to people who'll use it for entertainment or profit or both. Marcus Chen, self-made millionaire, under investigation for securities fraud. The headline was on 3 different news sites before Marcus made it to his car. Correction, the car that was about to be seized, the Tesla that would soon belong to the FBI's asset forfeiture program. His face stared back at him from phone screens, from computers, from the digital billboards that lined the streets. Social media was already ablaze with speculation, with schadenfreude, with people who'd always resented his success now celebrating his fall. And then came the phone call that broke something fundamental in Marcus's chest. Emma, his daughter, calling for the first time in 3 months, but not to offer support or ask if he was okay. Calling because she'd seen the news, because her friends had seen the news, because everyone at her school was talking about how Emma Chen's dad was a criminal. "Mom says you've been stealing money." Emma's voice was cold, distant, the voice of someone who'd already decided he was guilty. "She says you've been hiding assets from us, that you lied during the divorce. She says this is why you had so much money, because you were breaking the law." "Emma, sweetie, none of that is true. Someone framed me. Someone stole everything and made it look like I don't." The word was sharp, final. "Don't lie to me anymore, Dad. You've been lying my whole life. Lying about how you'd be at my games but never showed up. Lying about how you'd spend time with me but always had meetings. Lying about how the money was for my future when it was really just for your ego. And now you're lying about this. I don't want to hear it. Emma, please listen." "No, I'm done listening. Mom's lawyer says we might be able to sue you for the money you hid. We're going to take back what you stole from us. And then I never want to talk to you again." The call ended. Marcus stood on the sidewalk outside the federal building, surrounded by rushing pedestrians who had places to be and futures to pursue, and felt something inside him crack completely. His daughter thought he was a criminal. His ex-wife was preparing legal action. The FBI was building a case. His accounts were empty. His assets were frozen. His reputation was destroyed. And somewhere out there, David Reeves was probably sitting on a beach, drinking something with an umbrella in it, laughing at how perfectly his plan had worked. The eviction notice came 3 days later. Marcus's penthouse maintenance fees were delinquent, not because he hadn't paid them, but because the auto-pay account had been drained and the building management was remarkably unsympathetic to sob stories about FBI investigations. They gave him 72 hours to vacate, 72 hours to pack up 15 years of accumulated wealth, to sort through possessions that had defined his identity, to decide what few items he could carry into whatever came next. Sarah helped him pack. She showed up with boxes and packing tape, and that determined expression she wore when tackling impossible projects. She didn't ask questions. She didn't offer platitudes. She just worked alongside him in comfortable silence, wrapping dishes he'd never used in newspaper, boxing up books he'd never read, creating an inventory of a life that had turned out to be mostly performance. "You don't have to do this," Marcus said, watching her carefully pack one of his expensive watches, a Rolex that would probably be seized anyway once the FBI finished their asset inventory. "You could walk away, find another job. This isn't your problem." Sarah looked up at him, and her expression carried something Marcus couldn't quite identify. Not pity, not loyalty, something more complex. "I've worked for you for 6 years, Marcus. 6 years of watching you treat people like accessories, like props in your personal show. 6 years of you forgetting my birthday, cutting my bonuses when quarterly reports disappointed you, making me work weekends because your social calendar was more important than my family time. You want to know why I'm still here?" Marcus nodded, genuinely curious, because Sarah was right. He had treated her terribly, had taken her efficiency for granted, had assumed her loyalty was just another commodity he'd purchased. "Because this," Sarah gestured at the half-empty penthouse, at the boxes and the stripped walls and the evidence of Marcus's systematic dismantling. "This is the first time I've seen you actually human. The first time you've been vulnerable enough to need someone. And I'm staying because I want to see if there's something worth salvaging underneath all that arrogance. I'm staying because maybe, just maybe, losing everything will make you into someone worth working for." The words should have stung. They should have felt like an attack. But Marcus was beyond defending his ego. He was beyond pretending he'd been anything other than exactly what Sarah described. So he just nodded and kept packing, and together they reduced 15 years of supposed success into 17 boxes that fit in Sarah's Honda Civic. The apartment Sarah found him was in a neighborhood Marcus had never visited, would never have visited, the kind of place where his Tesla would have been stripped for parts in 15 minutes. The building was old, the elevator was broken, and Marcus's fourth-floor unit, calling it an apartment seemed too generous, consisted of a single room with a kitchenette, a bathroom he could barely stand up in, and windows that overlooked an alley where cats fought over garbage at 3 a.m. The rent was $800 a month. Sarah paid the first month and deposit from her own savings, a gesture of charity that would have humiliated Marcus a week ago, but now felt like a lifeline. "It's not much," Sarah said, looking around the dingy space with barely concealed dismay. "But it's a place to start, a place to start." As if Marcus was at the beginning of something rather than the end. As if this tiny, terrible apartment was a foundation rather than a grave. But he didn't argue. He couldn't afford to argue. He had exactly $37 left from his original 60, and that had to last until what? Until he found a job. Until the FBI finished their investigation. Until David magically reappeared with a confession and all of Marcus's money. That night, lying on a mattress Sarah had bought at a thrift store for $40, staring at water stains on the ceiling that suggested the upstairs neighbor had plumbing issues, Marcus confronted a question he'd been avoiding since the moment his banking app displayed those devastating zeros. Who was Marcus Chen without money? Strip away the expensive suits and the penthouse and the cars and the casual displays of wealth. What remained? What coexisted beneath the performance? And the terrifying answer, the one that kept him awake while cats shrieked in the alley below, was that he honestly didn't know. He'd spent so long being rich that he'd forgotten how to be anything else. The media feeding frenzy intensified over the following weeks. Every aspect of Marcus's life became public consumption. Reporters dug up his divorce records, interviewed former business associates who were suddenly eager to share stories about Marcus's ruthlessness, found college classmates who remembered him as arrogant even then. The narrative crystallized quickly. Marcus Chen was a monster who'd finally gotten his comeuppance, a modern Icarus whose wings had been made of stolen money rather than wax and feathers. The fall was satisfying to watch because the height had been so obnoxious. And through it all, David Reeves remained a ghost, vanished, disappeared, gone so completely that even the FBI couldn't track him down. But then Sarah called Marcus one evening, her voice tight with the kind of excitement that comes from discovering something important, something potentially life-changing. "I found something," she said. "I've been going through old server logs from the office, data the FBI didn't seize because it was on my personal backup drive, and I found an IP address." David accessed the company financial system from a location he shouldn't have been able to access from. He made one mistake, Marcus, just one, and it might be enough. For the first time in weeks, Marcus felt something other than despair. Hope was too strong a word, but possibility maybe, a crack in the perfect frame David had constructed, a thread Marcus could pull, unraveling the carefully woven lie. Where? Marcus asked, already moving, already planning. Where was he? The Carlisle Hotel. Downtown, 3 weeks ago, the night before all your money disappeared. He was using their business center, and the system logged his location. He probably thought he was being smart, using a public computer instead of his own. But he forgot that our company portal tracks entry points. We have proof he was there, proof he accessed your accounts without authorization. It wasn't much. It wasn't nearly enough to prove conspiracy or fraud or any of the crimes Marcus needed to prove to clear his name. But it was something, a starting point, a single factual thread in a tapestry of lies. And sometimes Marcus was learning, sometimes when you've lost everything and everyone thinks you're guilty and the entire world has decided your story is already written, sometimes all you need is one small thread to start pulling everything apart. But here's what Marcus didn't know yet, couldn't have known yet, wouldn't discover until it was almost too late. David wasn't working alone. The conspiracy went deeper than a disgruntled employee stealing from an arrogant boss. There were other players in this game, people with their own grievances, their own motivations, their own carefully concealed roles in Marcus's destruction. And the most devastating part, one of those people was someone Marcus had loved, someone he'd tried to protect, someone whose betrayal would hurt worse than all the stolen millions combined. Because the question wasn't just who stole Marcus Chen's money. The question was why someone would go to such elaborate lengths not just to steal, but to completely destroy him. What kind of hatred requires such precision? What kind of vengeance demands such thoroughness? And when you finally discover that the person who orchestrated your downfall is someone you trusted, someone you cared about, someone you never imagined could harbor such systematic rage, how do you even begin to process that betrayal? How do you reconcile the person you thought you knew with the person who methodically planned your annihilation? But the real question here, the one that should be keeping you awake at night, if everyone you've wronged over 15 years suddenly had the opportunity to take revenge, had the power to destroy you completely, had the motivation to watch you suffer, how many people would be standing in line? And how would you even begin to determine which one of them finally decided to act? Here's the question that separates survivors from victims. When you've lost everything and everyone believes you're guilty, when the evidence is stacked against you and the world has already written your ending, do you accept the narrative they've created, or do you fight to rewrite it yourself? Because Marcus Chen, sitting in his $800 apartment with water-stained ceilings and 43 cents in his pocket, was about to discover that sometimes the only way to prove your innocence is to become someone you've never been before, someone humble enough to ask for help, someone vulnerable enough to admit they need others, someone willing to rebuild from nothing because nothing is exactly what they deserve to have left. The Carlisle Hotel. Sarah's discovery of David's IP address felt like finding a compass when you're lost at sea. It doesn't immediately save you, but at least you know which direction to swim. Marcus stood outside the building 3 days after Sarah's revelation, staring at the revolving doors and trying to remember how to be someone who investigates rather than delegates. The old Marcus would have hired private detectives, thrown money at the problem until it solved itself. The new Marcus, the one wearing a thrift store jacket that didn't quite fit and shoes that were developing holes in the soles, had to do this himself because himself was all he had left. The hotel manager was a woman named Patricia Rodriguez who'd seen enough of life's complications to recognize desperation when it walked through her lobby. Marcus explained his situation with a humility that felt foreign on his tongue. No demands, no arrogance, just honest plea from someone who needed help. He expected rejection. He'd learned over the past month that the world had very little sympathy for fallen millionaires, that there was a particular satisfaction people took in watching the wealthy suffer. But Patricia surprised him. "I remember that guy," she said, pulling up records on her computer with practiced efficiency. "Your CFO, you said, he was here for 3 days, paid cash, which was unusual for our business center usage, spent hours on the computers. I noticed because he kept looking over his shoulder like he was doing something wrong." She paused, studying Marcus, with an expression that suggested she was making a calculation about his character. "The FBI already came asking about him. I gave them the same information I'm giving you, but they seemed more interested in building a case against you than finding him." The words confirmed what Marcus had suspected. The FBI had decided on their narrative and were selecting evidence that supported it while ignoring anything that complicated the story. He was their white-collar criminal, their example of wealthy corruption, their satisfying conclusion to an investigation that needed a villain. The fact that he might be innocent was an inconvenience they weren't particularly interested in exploring. Did he mention where he was going? Marcus asked, trying to keep the desperation out of his voice and failing completely. "Anything about his plans?" Patricia shook her head, but then hesitated, something flickering across her face. "There was one thing. He made a phone call from the business center. Our system logs outgoing calls for billing purposes. He called a local number, spoke for about 15 minutes. I can give you that number if you think it'll help." The number belonged to a law firm. Stewart and Associates, specializing in international asset protection and offshore tax strategy, exactly the kind of firm you'd need if you were planning to steal millions and hide them in jurisdictions that didn't cooperate with U.S. law enforcement. Marcus called them from Patricia's office, putting on his most authoritative voice, the one that used to open doors and command respect. He asked for David Reeves, claiming to be following up on their recent consultation. "Mr. Reeves isn't a client of ours," the receptionist said, her voice professionally polite. "But we did have a consultation with him regarding asset protection for a Mr. Marcus Chen. He said he was calling on your behalf, actually." "Is this regarding that matter?" The world tilted sideways. David had used Marcus's name, had established legal consultation for offshore asset protection in Marcus's name, creating another layer of evidence that made Marcus look guilty. Every action David had taken was designed not just to steal money, but to construct an unassailable case for Marcus's criminality. This wasn't theft. This was character assassination with a 7-year plan. Marcus thanked the receptionist and ended the call, his hands shaking with something that felt like rage, but was really just exhaustion mixed with overwhelming frustration. How do you fight someone who's thought of everything? How do you prove innocence when every piece of evidence has been manufactured to demonstrate guilt? The answer, he was learning, was that you couldn't do it alone. You needed allies. You needed people who believed in you enough to stand beside you when standing beside you made them look foolish or complicit. Sarah was waiting for him back at the apartment she'd found him, sitting on the $40 thrift store mattress with her laptop balanced on her knees, surrounded by printouts and sticky notes covered in her precise handwriting. She'd been conducting her own investigation, tracking David's digital footprints through old emails and server logs, building a timeline of his actions that revealed a conspiracy far more elaborate than Marcus had imagined. "He's been planning this for at least 2 years," Sarah said, not looking up from her screen. "I found emails going back that far where he's asking oddly specific questions about your account structures, your security protocols, your authorization procedures. At the time, I thought he was just being thorough, but looking at them now, knowing what we know Marcus, he was mapping your entire financial system, learning every weakness, identifying every vulnerability. 2 years. While Marcus had been buying yachts and celebrating acquisitions and treating David like expensive furniture, David had been methodically preparing Marcus's destruction. The patience required for that level of planning suggested hatred that went beyond professional resentment. This was personal, deeply, fundamentally personal. "There's something else," Sarah continued, and the careful way she said it made Marcus's stomach clench. "I found communication between David and someone else. The emails are encrypted and deleted, but I recovered fragments from backup servers. He was working with a partner, Marcus, someone who had their own reasons to want you destroyed, someone who provided David with information about your personal life, your divorce, your relationship with Emma, someone close to you." The pieces began assembling themselves in Marcus's mind, forming a picture he didn't want to see but couldn't ignore. His ex-wife, Catherine. She'd remarried a year after their divorce to a man Marcus had never bothered learning much about, because why would Marcus Chen care about his ex-wife's choices? But now, sitting in his tiny apartment with Sarah showing him fragments of recovered emails, Marcus forced himself to remember details he dismissed as irrelevant. Catherine's new husband worked in finance, had connections to offshore banking, had made comments during the divorce proceedings about Marcus's hidden assets that Marcus had interpreted as baseless accusations, but now seemed suspiciously specific. "Find out everything you can about Catherine's husband," Marcus said, and heard the old authoritative tone creeping back into his voice before catching himself. "Please, if you can, I know I'm asking a lot." Sarah smiled, a small expression that suggested she'd noticed the correction and appreciated it. "Already on it. His name is James Whitmore, former investment banker, forced out of Morgan Stanley 5 years ago under circumstances the company won't discuss publicly. Rumor is he was involved in a scheme similar to what they're accusing you of: offshore tax evasion, shell company manipulation. He was never formally charged, but his career was destroyed. And Marcus, here's the interesting part. You testified as an expert witness in the internal investigation. You helped build the case that got him fired." Memory clicked into place with devastating clarity. Marcus had forgotten completely. It had been just another consulting job, another few hours of testimony about financial systems and proper procedures. He'd never met James Whitmore personally, had just reviewed documentation and provided analysis. The man's career had ended, but Marcus had moved on without a second thought because other people's problems weren't his concern. He'd never imagined that testimony would create an enemy patient enough to wait 5 years, strategic enough to marry his ex-wife and gain access to personal information, methodical enough to orchestrate complete destruction. This wasn't just about money. This was revenge served cold and calculated, years in the planning, executed with precision that suggested professional expertise. James had used his knowledge of offshore banking to teach David how to steal and hide millions. He'd used his relationship with Catherine to learn Marcus's vulnerabilities, his passwords, his security question answers. He'd probably even helped Catherine file for divorce at exactly the right time, positioning himself to gain access to Marcus's life while appearing completely innocent. "We need proof," Marcus said, pacing the small apartment in 3 steps each direction. "Everything we have is circumstantial. We need something concrete that connects James to David, that proves they worked together, that demonstrates this was conspiracy rather than coincidence." Sarah closed her laptop with a decisive snap. "Then we need to find someone who can hack into systems we can't access legally. Someone with skills the FBI doesn't have because they're limited by warrants and regulations. Someone willing to work for free because you don't have money to pay them. She paused, looking at Marcus with an expression that suggested she knew what she was about to propose would cost him something more valuable than money. You remember Daniel Torres? The name hit Marcus like a punch. Daniel Torres. 5 years ago, Marcus had sued him for breach of contract after Daniel had failed to deliver on a software development project. The lawsuit had destroyed Daniel's small business, bankrupted him, forced him to take a job at a tech company where his considerable talents were wasted on mundane tasks. Marcus had won $40,000 in the judgment, money he'd never actually needed but had pursued anyway, because contracts were contracts and principles were principles, and letting people get away with failures set bad precedents. You want me to ask for help from someone whose life I destroyed? Marcus heard how broken his voice sounded, how completely the arrogance had been stripped away. I want you to apologize to someone you wronged and see if he's a big enough person to help you anyway, Sarah corrected. Because here's what I've learned about you, Marcus. You're not actually a bad person. You're just someone who spent so long being afraid of vulnerability that you weaponized success to protect yourself. You hurt people not because you enjoyed it, but because you didn't let yourself care enough to notice. And maybe, just maybe, if you show up at Daniel Torres' door and admit that you were wrong, admit that you need help, admit that you're sorry, maybe he'll be able to see past what you did to who you could become. The speech should have felt like an attack. Instead, it felt like absolution, like permission to be someone different, someone better, someone who could acknowledge mistakes without dissolving into nothing. Daniel Torres lived in a modest house in a neighborhood that reminded Marcus of the middle-class stability he'd grown up in, before ambition had convinced him that modest was another word for failure. Marcus stood on the porch for a full 3 minutes before finding the courage to ring the doorbell, rehearsing apologies that all sounded hollow, even in his own mind. How do you apologize for destroying someone's livelihood? What words possibly suffice? Daniel answered the door with recognition immediate in his eyes, not surprise, not confusion, just weary acknowledgement. Marcus Chen, I saw you on the news. FBI investigation, money laundering, all your accounts frozen. I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel a little satisfaction watching karma work. I deserved that, Marcus said, and meant it. I deserved worse than that. Daniel, I came here to apologize for what I did to you 5 years ago. The lawsuit, the bankruptcy, destroying your business over $40,000 I didn't even need. I was wrong. I was cruel. I was so focused on being right that I never stopped to consider what winning would cost you. And I'm sorry. I'm genuinely, truly sorry. The words hung between them, fragile and insufficient. Daniel studied Marcus with an expression that cycled through several emotions before settling on something cautious. Is this the part where you ask me for help? Because I saw that coming from about 3 sentences ago. Yes, Marcus admitted, because lying would defeat the entire purpose of this humiliating exercise. I need someone with your skills to help me prove I'm innocent. I can't pay you. I can barely feed myself. All I can offer is my apology and a promise that if I ever recover from this, I'll spend the rest of my life making sure what I did to you never happens to anyone else. Daniel leaned against his doorframe, arms crossed, looking like someone calculating the risk of believing a man who'd proven himself untrustworthy. The silence stretched long enough that Marcus started preparing himself for rejection. But then Daniel sighed, a sound of someone making a decision against their better judgment. I'll help you, he said, not because I forgive you, I'm not there yet, but because I believe in a justice system that actually works. And from what I've been reading, the FBI is more interested in convicting you than finding the truth. Plus, I've always wanted to take down an offshore banking scheme. Come in, let me hear what you've got. The next 2 weeks were the most intense of Marcus's life, not because of high-stakes deals or financial maneuvering, but because of genuine collaboration with people who had every reason to refuse him. Daniel dove into David's digital trail with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been bored at his corporate job for too long. He traced encrypted communications, recovered deleted files, followed money through shell corporations, and offshore accounts with the kind of skill that made Marcus understand why he'd hired Daniel in the first place. Sarah coordinated everything, managing information flow, keeping them organized, making sure no detail was overlooked. And Marcus, stripped of his usual role as commander and delegator, became the researcher, the grunt worker, the person who made coffee runs and sorted through endless documents. It was humbling. It was exhausting. It was the most purposeful Marcus had felt in 15 years. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday evening when Daniel managed to decrypt a series of messages between David and James Whitmore that laid out the entire conspiracy in devastating detail. They'd planned it for 2 years, just as Sarah had discovered. James had provided the offshore expertise. David had executed the theft. Catherine had supplied personal information, passwords disguised as security question answers, account numbers Marcus had carelessly mentioned during their marriage, details about his business operations from years of overhearing phone calls. She'd been complicit, motivated not just by James's manipulation, but by genuine resentment over years of emotional neglect during their marriage. "We need to take this to the FBI," Sarah said, reading through the messages with an expression that mixed triumph with sorrow. "This proves everything. This clears you completely." But Marcus was focused on one particular message, one line that made his chest physically ache. Emma had unknowingly helped. She'd given Catherine access codes to Marcus's home office computer, thinking she was helping her mother retrieve old family photos. Those access codes had allowed James to install monitoring software that captured every password Marcus entered, every account he accessed, every security measure he implemented. Emma hadn't meant to betray her father. She'd just been a 14-year-old girl who trusted her mother and didn't understand that trust could be weaponized. The FBI raid on James Whitmore's house happened at 6 in the morning, coordinated with arrests of David Reeves in the Cayman Islands, where he'd been living under an assumed identity. Marcus wasn't there for the dramatic confrontation, the handcuffs and perp walks, and satisfying moment of vindication. He was sitting in Agent Martinez's office, watching her expression shift from skeptical to shocked to professionally neutral as she reviewed the evidence Daniel had compiled. "This changes things," she admitted, her voice careful. "This changes everything. If this holds up, and it appears comprehensive enough that it should, then you're looking at a full exoneration. We'll need time to verify to build our case against Whitmore and Reeves, but Marcus, you should start looking at getting your assets unfrozen. You should start thinking about what comes next." What came next? As if Marcus knew, as if he had any plan beyond proving his innocence. The thought of getting his money back, of returning to his penthouse, of resuming his old life, it felt wrong somehow, incomplete, like trying to squeeze back into clothes you'd outgrown. The money came back in stages over the following months. Not all of it. Legal fees consumed a substantial portion, and some had been moved through so many shell corporations and offshore accounts that recovering it would take years of litigation. Marcus ended up with about 40% of his original wealth. $16 million, a fortune by any reasonable standard, but a fraction of what he'd lost. And strangely, the loss didn't hurt the way he'd expected. The number felt less important than it used to, less definitional. Emma's text message arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, 3 months after James and David had been arrested and charged with conspiracy, fraud, theft, and about 15 other crimes that would keep them in prison for decades. The message was short. "Can we talk? I saw the news. I'm sorry I didn't believe you." They met at a coffee shop neither of them had been to before, neutral territory without memories or associations. Emma looked older than Marcus remembered, more mature somehow, like the past year had aged her in ways that went beyond simple chronology. She sat across from him with her hands wrapped around a mug of hot chocolate, and Marcus noticed she still ordered it the same way she had when she was 8. Extra whipped cream, chocolate sprinkles, childish joy in a cup. Mom's lawyer says she might go to prison too, Emma said quietly, for helping James, for giving him information about you. She says she didn't know what he was planning, but I heard them talking. Before everything happened, she knew, Dad. She knew, and she helped anyway because she was angry at you, and I helped without knowing what I was helping with, and now everything's just broken. Marcus wanted to tell her it wasn't her fault. He wanted to explain that adults make terrible decisions and children shouldn't bear the weight of consequences they couldn't have predicted. But mostly, he just reached across the table and took her hand, a gesture of comfort he hadn't offered in years because he'd been too busy, too important, too focused on building empires to notice his daughter needed a father. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it more completely than he'd meant anything in his life. "I'm sorry I wasn't there for you. I'm sorry I let money become more important than our relationship. I'm sorry you had to watch your family fall apart because the adults in your life were too broken to do better. None of this is your fault, Emma, none of it." She cried then, messy tears that made her mascara run and reminded Marcus that she was still just 14, still a child, still someone who needed protection rather than judgment. And Marcus held her hand across the sticky coffee shop table and let her cry, and didn't try to fix it or solve it or throw money at it. Just existed in the moment with his daughter's pain, bearing witness to it because that's what fathers were supposed to do. The reconciliation wasn't immediate or dramatic. It was slow, tentative, built on weekly coffee shop meetings and careful conversations, and Marcus learning to be present rather than performative. Emma started calling him Dad instead of Marcus, small shift that carried enormous weight. She came to visit his new apartment, not the penthouse he could have afforded again, but the modest two-bedroom he'd chosen intentionally, place that felt like home rather than showpiece. She met Sarah, who'd transitioned from assistant to business partner in Marcus's new venture, because Marcus had started something different this time. Not a company built on aggressive acquisitions and ruthless efficiency, but a consulting firm that helped fraud victims navigate the complex process of recovering stolen assets. He used his expertise for something constructive, something that helped people instead of crushing them. Sarah handled operations. Daniel provided technical expertise. And Marcus, humbled and changed and still learning how to be better, worked alongside them as an equal partner rather than commanding CEO. The money helped. Of course it helped. $16 million solved a lot of practical problems, provided security and comfort and opportunities. But Marcus lived differently now. Modest apartment instead of penthouse. Used Honda instead of Tesla. Restaurants where he remembered the servers' names and asked about their lives because they were people, not props. He donated half his recovered fortune to charity, focusing on programs that helped people recovering from financial devastation, bankruptcy support, fraud victim advocacy, job training for those trying to rebuild. The money felt better leaving than it ever had arriving. And on a Thursday morning exactly 1 year after the night his accounts showed zero, Marcus stood at an ATM in his neighborhood, checking his balance, because he needed to verify a deposit had cleared. The number on the screen was comfortable without being excessive. Enough for security, not enough for ego. He smiled, not the arrogant laugh from the restaurant, but genuine contentment, the kind that comes from knowing who you are regardless of what you have. Emma was waiting for him at the nearby coffee shop. They had a standing Thursday morning tradition now, hot chocolate for her, black coffee for him, an hour of conversation before she went to school and he went to work. Simple routine, unremarkable habit, the kind of thing Marcus would have dismissed as waste of time a year ago. Now it was the best part of his week. "Did you figure out the deposit thing?" Emma asked when he sat down, already sipping her hot chocolate with extra whipped cream. "Yeah, it cleared. We're good." Marcus settled into his chair, the kind of ordinary exchange that felt extraordinary because it meant stability, normalcy, a life built on something more substantial than just numbers in an account. They talked about school, about Emma's friends, about the art project she was working on for her portfolio. Small things, normal things. The kind of conversation that would have bored Marcus into checking his phone a year ago, but now held his complete attention, because this was what mattered: connection, presence, being fully engaged with the person in front of him rather than the deals in his head. Sarah texted him halfway through their coffee. A client needed consultation. Could Marcus call them after his morning meeting? Morning meeting. That's what he called his time with Emma now. Not an obligation or interruption, but scheduled priority, protected time that work had to work around rather than through. He texted back that he'd call at 11, put his phone away, gave Emma his full attention. The story could end here, with Marcus redeemed and Emma reconciled, and everything neatly resolved into satisfying conclusion. But life isn't that simple, and growth isn't linear, and becoming better is ongoing process rather than destination. Marcus still struggled sometimes with old habits: the impulse to solve problems with money rather than attention, the temptation to value efficiency over empathy, the ingrained instinct to measure worth by achievement rather than character. But he was learning. Slowly, imperfectly, genuinely learning. Daniel became not just a business partner, but actual friend, someone Marcus grabbed beers with and complained to about normal problems and laughed with over shared frustrations. Sarah revealed herself to be not just efficient organizer, but creative thinker whose insights often exceeded Marcus's own. Emma started bringing friends around, introducing Marcus not as my rich dad, but just as my dad, ordinary description that meant everything. The relationships weren't transactional anymore. They were real. The company grew, not with the explosive aggression of Marcus's previous ventures, but with steady, sustainable expansion based on actually helping people. They won cases, recovered funds, rebuilt lives. The work was satisfying in ways that acquiring companies had never been. Marcus went home at night feeling tired but fulfilled, challenged but purposeful, successful but humble. And sometimes, late at night when sleep was elusive, Marcus thought about David and James sitting in their respective prisons, facing decades behind bars for conspiracy and fraud. He thought about Catherine, who'd received lighter sentence due to cooperation and genuine remorse, working through her own process of understanding how resentment had poisoned her judgment. He thought about all the people he'd hurt over 15 years of arrogant success, relationships he'd destroyed because he couldn't be bothered to care. He couldn't fix all of that. Some damage was permanent. Some bridges, once burned, stayed burned. But he could be better going forward. He could treat people with dignity. He could value relationships over transactions. He could remember that wealth was tool rather than identity, that success meant impact rather than accumulation, that the only legacy worth leaving was the difference you made in people's lives rather than the numbers in your accounts. The morning sun filtered through the coffee shop windows, casting golden light across the table where Marcus and Emma sat talking about everything and nothing, father and daughter rebuilding connection that should never have been broken in the first place. Emma laughed at something Marcus said, genuine, unguarded laugh that reminded him of when she was small, before money and divorce and neglect had complicated everything. And Marcus realized this moment, this simple Thursday morning coffee with his daughter, was worth more than every million he'd ever made or lost. Because here's what Marcus Chen learned through losing everything: your worth isn't defined by your bank account. Your identity isn't determined by your success. Your value doesn't disappear when your money does. Strip away the wealth and the status and the expensive possessions, and what remains is your humanity, your capacity for growth, your ability to change, your willingness to admit mistakes and do better. And that humanity, that authentic self beneath the performance, is the only thing that actually matters. The question that started this story, who was Marcus Chen without money, had finally been answered. He was someone learning to be human again. Someone discovering that falling could be the beginning rather than the end. Someone understanding that the best version of himself was the one willing to be vulnerable, to need others, to acknowledge imperfection and strive for improvement anyway. He was enough just as he was, right now, without needing to prove anything to anyone. And that realization, that fundamental shift in understanding what it means to have value, that was worth more than all the money in the world. So here's my question for you, because this isn't just Marcus's story, it's the universal human story of losing what we think defines us and discovering who we really are underneath. What would you lose if your bank account hit zero tomorrow? Not materially, but fundamentally. Would you know who you are without your money, your status, your accumulated success? And more importantly, are you building relationships and character that would survive that loss? Or are you, like Marcus was, constructing identity on foundation that could crumble in 47 seconds? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever lost something you thought defined you? How did it change you? Did you become better or bitter? Share your story, because maybe someone else needs to hear that falling doesn't have to be the end, that sometimes hitting bottom is exactly what we need to finally start building something real. If this story resonated with you, hit that like button and subscribe for more emotional journeys that explore what it really means to be human. And share this with someone who needs the reminder that your worth isn't measured in dollars. It's measured in how you treat people when you have nothing left to prove. Because in the end, the only balance that really matters is the one between who you are and who you're becoming. And that's a number no one can ever steal from you.